I'm Martin Blaney, and I'm here today to talk about the restoration of shortleaf pine in the Western Range and our work for 20 years on that. And I told you I've got some pretty pictures. This is the pine blue stem area that's kind of famous in our neck of the woods. I guess you guys have heard about that. But so what I want to do is bring some positive perspective of what's possible when a bunch of folks get together and collaborate together. Conservation partners, and are set around some mutual goals. And I'm going to look at some of the examples of the landscape projects that we've been able to undertake. I'm just going to be talking about the shortleaf part of that, but we're doing a lot more than that. And our intent, like I said, is to change the landscapes, a portion of the landscapes, back to that really rich and biodiverse ecological condition it used to be in. And that's woodlands, savannas, barrens, and glades. They were once very common and now are the rarest. So I just want to simply present our experience of shortleaf restoration and serve as an encouragement that as a group in this room with an interest of an initiative that these things are possible. Same photo, 1920, Jessicaville Ranger District on the Ouachitas. So we've learned quite a bit by gleaning through and investigating our historic records, and I showed you just a hint of the history of fire on our landscape from 1600s. Writings left behind by naturalists, explorers, Schoolcraft in 1817, talking about all of the wildflowers and grass understories. And really important, the General Land Office survey records, 1822 to 1845. In a previous life, I was a registered forester, and I spent a lot of time in courthouses looking through those records, and they were an incredible resource about the assessment of our landscapes in that time. So I'd like to, I'll have some research findings about our restoration work on how it impacted flora and fauna. But I do want to present some preliminary thoughts if you're thinking about doing this kind of restoration on a landscape scale, some things to think about beforehand, and some lessons learned as we engaged the management practices we did. And then, because we fall prey to recipes, I want to emphasize that all sites are different, and they're very individualistic, and beware of recipes. Then Jane was brought up the Interior Highlands Shortleaf Initiative, and one of the goals that we chose was we wanted to capture in forest metric terms the desired future conditions of these restored. What, once it's restored back to that, what does that look like? And to be fair to managers, we wanted to scale that down to metric terms that they were used to taking. And then at the very end, I'll go over the DFCs, is what I'm going to refer to. And then I would like to conclude with our more recent efforts of outreach toward private landowners that had shortleaf on their property. So, back in the 90s, the recovery plan of the RCW had been approved, and some folks on the Ouachita National Forest, Larry Hedrick for one, and George Burkhoffer and Warren Montague and a few others, successfully amended the Ouachita plan to form a large-scale management area, RCW restoration area, 250,000 acres. And it was the research and the outcome of that on what they were creating or recreating that really inspired a lot of us other people. And you know, they probably got tired of giving tours, but they were the successful one on the block. So at about the same time, we were starting on doing that kind of stuff on our property. Game and fish properties, natural heritage was coming on. And so with the reintroduction of a historic fire regime, coupled with forest thinning, we all started seeing this new planet of floral response that was just amazing. Actually, it was a very old planet. Perennial plants numbering over 150. Anyways, so if you'd read the writings of Schoolcraft and looked at the survey notes, you knew that's what it looked like. We were getting there. So what are we talking about restored conditions? Obviously, fire maintained habitats, more open canopies, but a ground cover, a two-stage, open canopy with a lot of herbaceous plants under it. It was once common, is not to say enough. Actually, 70%. Imagine where we are here in the Western Range, the treeless prairies to the west. We were really a transition from that. 70% woodlands, savannas, and glades, and 30% what we would consider forests nowadays. So we lost a lot. And with 100 years of fire suppression, the species that came along with that are rare too. So when we wrote our wildlife action plan, most all of our terrestrial communities above the floodplain, including Shortleaf, had a lot of species of greatest conservation need that were actually fire adapted also. What you see here is the first hint of what our work did. We separated out 3 different shortleaf communities in our work that cover our part of the Western Range. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Going out on a limb, and I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but when we started our work, it's really beneficial if you're all talking about the same terms. I know pine savanna over here means something to y'all, but when we had interchanging terms of I'm doing woodland restoration, I'm creating a savanna, I just took a shot at it. So this is arguable at best, but I at least tried to differentiate between the terms we were using, because a prairie is a prairie and a savanna is actually a prairie with a few trees in it. And those trees have this characteristic, they grew in the open. They're long-lived species. And so it's a different thing in the Western Range. Woodlands, open and closed, is a open canopy, forested tract that actually doesn't have much of a mid-story or understory woody, but has a herbaceous understory. And forests, as we know, multi-layered, but pretty well 90% woody species. So let's look at a few of the sites that we restored or began to restore, and some of them are still in the process. The first is this pine bluestem area on the Ouachita National Forest. So imagine, before I get there, this is the Western Range of Shortleaf, and you can see its density is the highest in the Ouachita Mountains and southeastern Missouri. And that 250,000 acres I have a gold circle around is that management area. They revised their plan. So approximately 130,000, a little more, acres of that area are in some stage of being restored, because restoration is a process. It's a process of repetitive treatments through time, primarily fire, but also keeping the canopy open periodically, because shade is not what we're after. Very little mid-story in the pine blue stem area because of its ecological placement, burned more regularly, and being an RCW, it was perfect because you really don't need a mid-story and you don't need an understory. You want as much herbaceous as you can get. And the biodiversity is incredible. So that's what that looks like. So a process. We're finding that the species richness of the site continues to increase during the first 3 rotations and into the 4th rotation of burning. Constantly new plants are coming. So the fire regime, which includes the intensity, the frequency, and the seasonality of which you're burning, all influences that plant community that you hope is still on the landscape. Another collaboration was going on in mid-90s on the Ozark, and John Andre and Steve Osborne, a couple wildlife biologists, wanted to, they were dabbling in putting fire back in pine and hardwood sites, and I remember thinking, I don't know if I'm okay with this, but I was a forester. So they collaborated with Nature Conservancy and gleaned out some National Fire Plan money. We made a conduit down to the Ozark National Forest for money that was going west. And very successful collaboration, but it ended up being 60,000 acres of restoration areas on several ranger districts. This is the Middle Fork, it's now on the Big Piney, and Shortleaf was part of it. There's a lot of bird work done on this, a lot of monitoring, and small mammal research on this, and all kind of pushing us along. And then after the completion of our wildlife action plans, the Doris Duke Foundation made available a grant for 2 states that would work together to step down their conservation strategies from their wildlife action plans to the ground. And Missouri initiated that. They called Arkansas, they called me, and said, do you want to play? Of course, yeah. But they were after shortleaf restoration, and I said, if we can make that pine oak, that would be great. Let's do that. Because when you're doing a landscape, you're going to touch many different vegetative communities. You're going to touch pine oak, you're going to touch oak, hickory, you're going to have riparians, a bunch of different ecological conditions that you're putting fire back in. So I show this map. What we did on the Arkansas side was carved out a 320,000 acre landscape made up of state and federal properties. So we had Gulf Mountain Wildlife Management Area, which is right adjacent to the Big Piney Ranger District of the Ozark, and bleeded into Gene Rush Wildlife Management Area that bled right into a portion of the National River, the Buffalo River, so National Park Service. We also had private landowner inside this, so we had another partner. By the way, I've highlighted that previous slide of the Middle Fork. That's where it's located. So with agencies already having plans, because the forest plan right here on the Ozark that we helped write as partners was an emphasis area for woodlands restoration already. And we had habitat prescriptions on our wildlife management areas and desired conditions moving toward woodlands on those. So, and we were burning with the National River as a partner. So with that in place, already management plans in place, agencies that were already working together and conducting this restoration work on their own, we were just a really good bet for getting that grant and others. And then moving forward to the CLFRP days, the stars lined up for us, and as a part of that program, all 3 national forests within the western range of Shortleaf, their plans were approved. So we had CLFRP on Mark Twain, the Ozark St. Francis, and the Ouachita National Forest. Now, this is not my slide, but the little turquoise polygons are where all of that work in those plans was going to be implemented. So just taking a look at some more pictures of it. This is a dormant picture of the pine blue stem, kind of in a stage toward restoration. And then I love this photo. This is Hess's Knob on the Ozark National Forest, and that's about, at that point, that's as diverse as I've seen a restoration of plants. Our plant ecologist from the Natural Heritage Commission found 17 different species of legumes. 4 and 5 were native Lespedicias, and tubers, just a Ryan's cafeteria of food-producing plants, seeds and tubers and berries. Bears were all over it. In addition to that, just as we've talked about, high cover from the grasses and other little bit of shrubs that we had. You were just out of luck if you were a skunk trying to find a turkey nest. I mean, that's kind of what we envision the portions of the landscape to look like. So I guess I'll go into the lessons learned, because there are continuing lessons learned in doing this, but I would like to catch up. A couple thoughts to think about when you're trying to plan a restoration site, very important. Is that plant community available? You're considering a site, immediately land use history and historic fire regimes come to play. You've got to do your research. You see, so many of the sites in this region, and others, probably yours, were so misused through land use practices, overgrazed, allowed to erode, intense wildfires, depleted or just pretty well eliminated the native seed sorts of those herbaceous perennial plants. So you've got to investigate a site before you do, and in the first cases we did. So we do have some cases where we were trying to restore something that really wasn't there. So you should check. You can check the roadside ditches. You can check areas within that you've burned or tree gaps. But you need to be looking for those conservative plant species that give you an indicator. So as a part of the DFCs that I'll go over in a minute, we included a list of species in Missouri and Arkansas that are kind of indicative of the herbaceous community that you'd expect. And we've developed a plant list, about 5 to 10, that some of our managers, they can learn them easy, recognize them, but that's really important. Now, Missouri took a different route. They used floristic quality index plots at about $900 a pop. But when you think about what they avoided, well, with limited manpower and limited funding, those plots really told them where they should work instead of where they shouldn't. So another pretty picture. This is Post Oak Savannah Ridgetop and on the Ozark, and about 11 years of management when this picture was taken. So that's 3 burns going on 4, and it's just really quality. 150 plus species of native. Anyways, picture's worth 1,000 words. I'll let it talk. So I'll put some bullets up here about these lessons learned and adding a few. First of all, is your site likely restorable? That's a good one. But we also find that in restoration, we should probably limit burning if you're not going to thin. We do have partners that do a lot of burning, and it's not fuel reduction, it's burning. And if you don't thin, I don't know what the expectation is, except probably a greater chance of erosion. Okay? So as partners and collaborators, it's pretty cool. You get to talk to each other when it's hard too. But we're trying to, and we're making some headway that way. We don't want to deplete the seed source, but let me go on. During the restoration phase, we all agreed in that group, don't miss your 3-year rotation. During the restoration phase, do not, whatever you can help, do not miss a 3-year window. If you have a 2-year window, burn the 2-year. But no, I'm just saying, we have lost a site, because it's very true, and I've had it happen to where you have a native, natural, shortleaf pine stand, and you oak it up. Can't say any different. You miss, and just it's magic. And there's no oaks in the stand, and it's going to oak up. So, doing okay on time? All right, and then here's one a lot of people wouldn't think of, merchantability. You know, I'm not going to buy a chainsaw, and I'm not going to go cut and haul those trees. They have commercial value, and when you do the thinning on these to get to the open canopy, it's a commercial endeavor. Well, if you do all of it at once, you're going to mess up, because you have to have enough stocking in your restoration area 3 burns from now to be able to bring in a contractor in to also open the canopy again. So a wise manager is thinking that ahead and taking a slow route of it. The other thing we run into is, as industry and the forest products industry changes and continues to change, they're probably eventually just going to want a pile of sawdust. But right now, if you're thinking about restoring these huge shortleaf pines, you know, and they live 300 years, you know, well, they're not going to take them at the mill unless you have a bandsaw mill, and there's one in that portion of the state. There's a couple in our state in North Arkansas, but the regular mills won't take anything over a 20. So you got to keep that in mind. Here's one for Joy, Dr. O'Keefe. The benefit of this landscape restoration is, whether in shortleaf pine or hardwood, but more in hardwood, you got to plan around losing about 10 basal area per acre within 15 years, because you're putting fire in a system that hasn't had fire like that for a long time. You can kill shortleaf, but you're probably going to have some mortality. So why do I say that? Because I had managers fall prey to a recipe and took their forest down to 60, the first thing they did, and of course they created a savanna by the time 15 years went by. So that wasn't the prescription. And managers, you just got to watch out for recipes. You've got to think this. You got to know your site and not do too much at once. The last lesson learned is, I'm just going to say it, just go ahead and afford the chemical. We are not growing. We're trying to grow grasses, forbs, sedges, not hardwood brush. If you're going to restore a site and you want a herbaceous understory to persist, this is the best route. What we do is we inject all of the wood in mid-story, understory from 7 inches and down, because 8 inches and up is merchantable and we'll get some money for it. But You kill it at the root, or you're going to fight it from the very beginning. So a brief prescription, I would say, is that at first, a site you catch up with the fuels that have accumulated for decades. You do dormant seasons, might take a few. And then we use the herbicides and get rid of the mid-story. And while that's standing dead and not available fuel, we try to get another burn in. So because you're about to add a lot of fuel to your landscape, try and get another burn in because you want a period of time to be able to do the commercial endeavor of thinning the overstory and taking out the merchantable midstory, and being able to get in there as quick as you can with fire again. So you're going to log it probably with whole tree logging, pulling in as much slash as you can out of the woods so that you don't have to fight fuel loads and wait for them to melt down before you can safely burn again with a correct intensity. And then stay on a 3-year. So I'll go into the work now of the DFCs. And like I said, this is for ecological conditions. And I feel it really, I've been a part of a DFC target before, and it's incumbent upon those that put out a management strategy like this, it's incumbent upon them of either doing the training to manage for managers or providing managers with the forest indices they can measure. And that's what we had in mind. So as we started designing these different parameters under these 3 different shortleaf communities, we were thinking about turning that into basal area and trees per acre. So we simplified. We do have 7 nature serve shortleaf communities in the Western Range, but to make it simpler for managers and private landowners, we boiled them down to this. So the forest variables that are most important in this scenario is obviously light. So if you start with the desired condition at the ground and how much herbaceous growth do I want, you've got to consider then how much light do I want each of these layers of my site. What percentage cover can I handle? In the pine blue stem, as you'll see, the pine blue stem area would have been 80 to 100% ground cover as far as a desired condition for the future. So you really don't need much of an understory or midstory to have that much allowable light come down through to the forest floor. So basal area and tree density are the surrogates for managing light, which forest managers aren't used to doing, and it's a little bit more subjective. This is less. And then the disturbance regime of these sites differ only by the fire regime, really. Fire is that. So here again, the regime is the frequency of return, the intensity of the fire, and the seasonality. So to pull this into metrics, several of us went out and we needed a database of DBH to crown radius ratio to be able to do a Gingrich type table of stocking and turn this into something a forest manager or a trained manager could use. So we measured lots of shortleaf pines, mature shortleaf, that were forest grown. We went to the Ozark National Forest where they had just thinned what would have been a closed forest and gathered a bunch of our information. And it allowed us to put things in this table form to where at the top we have our canopy closure by percent in tens and our average diameter per acre, per site for the stand, average DVH. And I have to remind people, basal area really doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't know this. And so if, to give an example, if I have a 16-inch average diameter stand and I wanted a 50% closed to open, that would communicate to the manager, we're talking about a stocking of 44 trees per acre or about 60 basal area, a target. But remember, we're not wanting to go there right away. That's our desired condition in the future. So what we've also superimposed on here are these three shortleaf communities, the pine blue stem, the shortleaf pine dry oak woodland, and the shortleaf dry mesic oak community. And these are the percentages ranges of the canopy for those, which gets us to the overall range of variables. And I'll add, all of this is in your plan. It's an appendix in your plan, our work on this, along with the discussions about why we chose some of these numbers. So there I said, for the higher percentage of ground layer desired, the less mid-story and understory is required. So I won't talk too much more about that, but you have this work in your white bag. So as to keep us on time, the only thing I was going to talk about effects, many of you know, but sometimes an unexpected happens, and we expected great wildlife habitat. You saw the pictures, okay? Cover, food, everything, protection. But there's a Baltimore checker spot butterfly, and it showed up on Gene Rush Wildlife Management Area, and outside of its known range. And it was about 3 burns in when we started getting yellow false foxglove, a bush about that high, perennial, and that's when we found these. And now they're in many places on the Ozark up there. So quail, I think Ron Masters' stuff on the shortleaf, the pine blue stem, 19 times the frequency of bobwhite to the untreated. Other things that have been, of course, RCW, I said I'd show. This is when their work started, 94, 95. So boom. Butterflies, numbers were lowest in the untreated. This bat that Roger did, bat survey on the Washita restoration area, preferred to roost in thinned and burned. And small mammals, greater abundance, deer forage, 7-fold increase, that kind of stuff. We have rattlesnake, almost 20 years of timber rattlesnake studies by Dr. Steve Brupri out of U of A, and he just told me a couple of years ago, body weights are up, and that's good. Okay, so you have small mammals. Okay. So outreach, real quick. We wanted to, we knew that we were going to outreach somehow to private landowners. Well, one of our partners, we were having a conversation about what is the Stevens and Wyden Act buffer outside of the federal lands. What is that buffer? Is it 3 miles? And we were arguing, and George Reinhardt said it's 10-mile buffer. We automatically said, there's our focal polygon for private lands. So if I put a buffer around our federal properties of the Ozark National Forest and the Washitas, well, he put on the 2-chief decision in 2014, George wrote a program for western and northern Arkansas here, counties. The yellow circles are landowners that enrolled. dedicated the money, and they were prioritized if they had shortleaf pine within that focal zone, that 10 mile. All right. 2015, Missouri came up with a two chiefs, also submitted a two chiefs project, but the difference is their landowners were prioritized to have shortleaf pine adjacent to federal lands because they knew they probably couldn't handle all of the applicants. They wanted to test the water. Well, so what you're looking at is the Western Range, all of the public lands in Arkansas and Missouri, and we just put a buffer around it and said, those are the targeted landowners for our outreach for technical assistance and cost incentives to manage their shortleaf forests. Didn't say how, just, it's their objectives. All right, that's great. So that's where we are right now.